The sound she would remember was not the gunshot. It was the silence after. The way a building full of armed men could go completely, terrifyingly still in the 2 seconds after a shot was fired in a place where shots were not supposed to be fired. Blair Mack had both hands pressed flat against a man's thigh. The blood was warm. It was always warm. She had learned that in training, confirmed it in field exercises, and now she was learning it again in the way you learn things that matter most, at speed, in the dark, with no one watching but the man dying under your hands. The corridor was concrete, navy gray. Fluorescent lighting buzzed and flickered at the far end where a bullet had taken out the fixture. She could hear breathing behind her. Rapid, male. Somebody was still alive back there. She pressed harder. The figure at the end of the corridor moved, not walking, tactical, deliberate, advancing along the wall with the slow, patient precision of someone who had done this before. The weapon came up. She tracked it. She calculated the angle. She did the math that people who have been trained to do the math do without meaning to, measuring distance and trajectory and time remaining. Her hands stayed where they were. But then something shifted in her. Something that had been trained into her by cold mornings and silent men and 10,000 hours in positions most people never knew existed. Her left hand came off the wound, reached toward the holster at her hip. And the image froze. Her voice came quiet and even, as if she were describing something that had happened to someone else entirely. They called it the wrong building, sweetheart. The 6'2" chief who said it had a voice like gravel and eyes that had stopped being surprised by anything years before she was born. He meant it as a dismissal. Most people would have taken it that way. He was right about the building. He was wrong about everything else. 72 hours earlier, Naval Special Warfare Command, Coronado, California, October. The base smelled the way military installations always smell: jet fuel and salt air, and something underneath both of them that was harder to name. The smell of men who had been somewhere and come back changed. Blair Mack had grown up around that smell. She knew it the way she knew the weight of a tourniquet in her pocket and the exact feel of an M18 pistol in her right hand, and the particular quality of silence that falls over a room when someone enters it who does not belong. She was 24 years old, 5 feet 3 inches tall, 118 pounds with her kit on. The medical kit she carried weighed 42 pounds. She had packed it herself at 4 in the morning, the same way she packed it every time, checking each item twice against a list she had memorized 3 years ago and had not needed to look at since. The sea bag she had packed in 7 minutes. The medical kit had taken 40. Master Chief Home Cray met her at the administrative building. He was a compact man in his late 40s with the kind of face that had learned long ago how to give nothing away. His handshake was brief and exact. He checked her face when he thought she was not watching, the way people do when they are confirming something they already suspected. He walked her to the evaluation briefing room without speaking. SEAL Team 7 was already there. There were 8 of them. Blair counted without looking like she was counting. Old habit. They were large men, most of them. The kind of large that comes not from a gym, but from years of carrying weight across ground that did not want to be crossed. They sat in folding chairs or leaned against the wall with the particular posture of men who are not at ease but are very good at looking like they are. One of them was watching her with something that was not hostility, not friendliness either, something more careful than either. He was sitting apart from the others, forearms resting on his knees, a coffee cup on the floor between his boots. He was younger than most of the team, somewhere in his early 30s, with a jaw that had taken at least one significant impact at some point and healed at a slight angle. His name tape said 4. Blair noted him and looked away. The rest of the team watched her set down the medical kit with expressions that ranged from disinterest to amusement. One of them said something too low to hear. Another one smiled. She did not react. She had been not reacting her entire life. The chief, who had been standing near the window, turned around. Nalen Kreft was 6'2" and built like something engineered for a specific and unforgiving purpose. He was 36 years old and had the eyes of a man who was 20 years older than that in every way that mattered. His hair was close-cropped and his jaw was set, and he crossed the room without hurrying and stopped 3 feet from Blair and looked at her the way a range officer looks at a weapon that has been improperly stored. He said, "SEAL Team 7 lost our last corpsman 8 months ago. Oman. His name was Martinez." He let that sit for a moment. He was good. Then he turned and walked back to the window. The room did not fill with sound. Nobody looked at Blair to gauge her reaction. Nobody had to. The message had been delivered with the precision of a man who knew exactly what he was doing and what he wanted it to accomplish, and what it would cost if it did not accomplish it. She held his gaze until he turned away. Then she set her medical kit down on the table in front of her. She unzipped the top pouch and checked the contents, checked them again. Her hands did not shake. From across the room, Tate 4 watched this. He did not smile. He did not look away either. He picked up his coffee cup from the floor and drank from it and said nothing at all. After the team had been dismissed, Cray asked her to wait. The room emptied the way rooms empty when soldiers leave them. Efficient. Final. Like water draining from a surface that had no use for it anymore. Blair stood next to the briefing table and watched the last man out, and then the door closed and it was just her and the Master Chief and the particular weight of whatever was about to be said. Cray set a folder on the table. He did not push it toward her. He set it down and stepped back, as if giving her the option to decide whether she wanted it. She picked it up. The folder contained Martinez's service record. 3 pages of administrative language that translates a human life into boxes and codes and dates. Date of birth, date of enlistment, last permanent duty station, commendations. Blair read it the way she read everything, moving through the information for what mattered and discarding the rest. She found it on the last page. One line was redacted, a thick black bar where information had been removed. Beneath it, a date. She recognized the date because she had been thinking about it for 8 months without stopping. And below the date, in a handwriting that was not government standard and not printed but small and deliberate and angular, someone had written 4 words. Request for eval, H.M. Mack. Blair did not react. She was very good at not reacting. She set the folder back on the table and looked at Cray. He said, "I wanted you to see that before tomorrow." She nodded once and said nothing. She walked back to her temporary quarters in the fading October light and sat on the edge of the rack and looked at her hands for a long time. They were small hands. People mentioned this sometimes. Usually people who had not yet seen what she could do with them. She got up and began reorganizing her medical kit. Not because it needed it, because it was something to do with her hands. Something cold and precise and entirely within her control. Outside, the Pacific moved in the dark below the ridge, and the base lights came on one by one in the gathering dusk. The next morning came gray and fast. Physical training at 5 in the morning with the evaluation cadre. Blair ran the course at the pace they set. Not faster, not slower. She did not look at the team members watching from the building entrance as she came around the last bend. She kept her eyes forward and her breathing steady and finished in the middle of the group, which was exactly where she intended to finish. Kreft was waiting outside the administrative building afterward. He had a tablet in his hand. He looked like a man who had been waiting for some time and was not accustomed to waiting. He said, "You want to explain the 3 rejections?" Blair looked at him without speaking. 3 separate applications to the Combat Medical Readiness Integration Cycle, he said. Rejected twice for failure to comply with tactical evacuation protocol. Rejected once for insubordination toward an evaluating officer. He looked up from the tablet. "That is your record. That is what I am looking at right now." Blair said, "Read the incident reports, not the conclusions." Kreft studied her. Something moved behind his eyes that was not quite what it had been a moment before. He did not look away. That afternoon, before the first formal evaluation began, Cray found Kreft in the passageway outside the armory and spoke to him in a voice low enough that it did not carry beyond the 2 of them. Blair, passing at the far end of the corridor on her way to the medical bay, heard none of it, but she saw Kreft's face shift. She saw something close in it that had been open a moment before. What Cray told him was this. The 3 rejections had not been failures. On the first 2 applications, Blair had deliberately underperformed on the physical fitness evaluation. Not by much, just enough. Enough to be rooted to evaluation support duty rather than team integration. Enough to get her into the administrative buildings of the Naval Special Warfare Medical Command rather than onto the training ground. Enough to get her physically near the records she had been trying to access. Each time, someone had changed her assignment, redirected her away from where she was trying to go, moved her paperwork quietly and efficiently before she could get close enough to matter. The 3rd rejection, for insubordination, had come when she refused a direct evaluator order to leave a training casualty, unattended in order to advance to the next scenario on the assessment clock. She had argued, in front of 2 senior NCOs and a full evaluation board, that no medic worth the title abandons a wounded man because a clock is running. She had been right. She had also been wrong about the timing. The board had found her insubordinate anyway. The record reflected the finding, not the argument. She had applied 4 separate times to reach this program and this room. Kreft stood in the passageway for a long moment after Cray finished speaking. He looked at the door at the end of the corridor without expression. His jaw worked once. He said nothing. The first formal evaluation was the Tactical Combat Casualty Care Lane. 4 simulated casualties. 8 minutes. Blair, alone. The team watched through one-way glass, most of them with their arms crossed. Kreft stood at the back with his hands in his pockets and his eyes on the floor of the evaluation bay. Tate 4 stood slightly apart, watching not the window but the room itself, as if his attention were occupied by something the scenario was not designed to test. The scenario began. What happened next was not something most of the men watching had seen before. Not the speed, though the speed was real and it was significant. And not the technique, though the technique was precise at a pace that compressed 8 minutes into 5 minutes and 47 seconds while still completing each critical step in the correct sequence. What they had not seen before was the quality of her stillness. The way she moved from one casualty to the next without wasted motion, without the micro-hesitations that appear under pressure even in experienced medics, without looking at the clock, without asking the scenario monitor for confirmation. She did not perform competence. She exercised it, the way people exercise things they have owned so long they no longer think about owning them. She moved like someone who had done this before in conditions that were not a training lane. When she reached the 4th casualty, something changed. The mannequin was dressed in the utility blouse of a Navy Corpsman. It wore the medical cross patch on its left shoulder. Blair knelt over it, checked the airway, assessed the simulated wound profile. Her hands kept moving, but she stopped. 3 full seconds. Not a technical pause, not a protocol hesitation, not a break required by the scenario parameters, just stillness. The kind of stillness that comes from somewhere below training, somewhere in the part of a person that knows things before the mind catches up. Then she finished the assessment, called the lane complete, stepped back toward the exit. Behind the glass, Kreft uncrossed his arms. He did not speak. He stood for a moment looking at the floor of the evaluation bay. Then he turned and walked toward the door. Tate 4 watched him go. Later that evening, Kreft sat alone in his quarters and thought about the 3-second pause over a mannequin wearing a corpsman's patch. He thought about it longer than the professional part of him said was appropriate. He kept thinking about it anyway. The base armory ran 24 hours. Blair went after evening chow. She told herself it was routine familiarization. She was not entirely sure that was the truth. The weapons were racked along the wall in standard configuration. M18 service pistol, M110 semi-automatic sniper system, a Mk20 SSR on the upper shelf, standard evaluation loadout. She had studied their specifications during the transit flight to Coronado. She knew their weights and their operating characteristics and could field strip and reassemble any of them faster than the documentation suggested was achievable. But at the back of the rack, behind the other weapons and slightly separate from them, was a rifle she had not expected. M40A6, bolt-action precision rifle, the long gun of the United States Marine Corps Scout Sniper Program, chambered in 7.62x51 NATO, capable of consistent first-round hits at ranges that require more than skill to achieve. The rack card marked range demo. Below it, do not issue. She walked toward it before she had decided to walk toward it. The stock was worn in the way stocks get worn from actual use, not from storage or display. The bipod showed the small layered scratches of regular field deployment across years and terrain. She did not touch it. She stood 2 feet away and studied it with the quality of attention she had learned from a man who believed you observed a thing completely before you ever put your hands on it. Her eyes moved to the elevation knob. There was a mark there. Small, deliberate, scratched into the metal at the base of the turret adjustment. A repeating symbol no larger than a thumbnail. 3 short lines radiating from a central point, like the impression of a crow's foot pressed into wet earth. Blair's breathing did not change. She looked at the mark for 4 seconds. Then she turned and walked out of the armory and did not look back. In her room, she sat on the rack and looked at the opposite bulkhead and said nothing. But in the silence, as sometimes happened when she was alone and her defenses had come down from the effort of the day, she heard a voice. Flat, dry, economical with words in the way that certain men are economical with everything they value. The voice did not give instruction. It did not explain itself. She already knew the mark. She closed her eyes for a moment. Then she reached for her kit bag and began the end-of-day inventory. Her hands moved without thought, checking each item, returning it to its place, cold and precise and doing what they had always done. Tate 4 found her at 2100 in the equipment maintenance bay. She was cleaning her M18 at the work table, the components laid out in the arrangement she always used, each piece in its designated position. She heard the door and did not look up. 4 pulled a stool over and sat down. He did not reach for any tools. He sat for a moment in the way people sit when they have arrived at something they have been working toward for a while and are taking the last few steps carefully. He said, "You paused over the 4th one." She kept moving the cleaning rod through the barrel, cleaning protocol. He said, "That one had a corpsman patch." She said nothing. He was quiet for a moment. Then, Martinez used to say the worst thing about being a medic in this unit was that you become the person everyone talks to but nobody actually looks at. A pause. He said it more than once. He meant it every time. The cleaning rod moved through the barrel, steady, even. He kept a journal, Four said. Through every deployment, every operation. He said writing kept him straight in the head when everything else was trying to make it crooked. Blair said, "Where is it?" Admin said it was lost in transit, coming back from Oman. He picked up the barrel assembly, looked at it without seeing it, set it down. 8 months and nobody has located it. Another pause. I looked twice. The room was quiet except for the cleaning equipment and the distant sound of the ocean working against the coast in the dark. Blair set down the cleaning rod. She looked at Four. He was looking at the parts on the table with the expression of a man who has been carrying something heavy for a long time and has stopped being able to distinguish between the weight and the carrying. She said, "Why are you telling me this?" He thought about it, genuinely thought about it, not the way people think about things when they already know the answer they are going to give. Then he said, "Because you paused." He stood up, pushed the stool back to its place, left without saying anything more. Blair sat alone in the maintenance bay for a while longer. The M18 parts were spread across the table. She began reassembling them in the half-dark, her fingers finding each component and fitting it to the next without instruction, guided by the kind of knowledge that lives below thought in the hands of people who have done a thing enough times that doing it has become a form of breathing. Outside, the base had settled into its nighttime rhythms. The Pacific pushed against the California coast in the dark, steady, indifferent, the way large things are. The range test came at 8 in the morning. Overcast. Wind from the southwest at 11 knots when they reached the firing line and building toward 12. The range officer called conditions as moderate adverse. In training language, that meant acceptable. In practical language, it meant the kind of morning that separates what people know from what they can actually do with what they know under pressure. Kreft was there. Most of the team was there. They stood back from the firing positions in the way that people stand when they are watching something they have already decided they understand the outcome of. The evaluation began with the M18 service pistol at 25 meters. Blair ran the qualification course without comment, without visible effort, without any of the small performances people sometimes layer over genuine skill, because they are not confident enough to let the skill stand alone. When the scoring was complete, the range officer read the result without expression. Distinguished expert. The highest category on the military firearms qualification scale. The score that takes most trained shooters years to achieve with any consistency in evaluation conditions. Nobody on the team said anything. Kreft said, "That is the basic pistol qualification." Cray said, "Yes." He picked up a range card from the table and walked it over to Blair. "This is the secondary evaluation." She read the card, 600 meters, moving targets, crosswind 12 knots. She looked up. Cray said, "The M40A6. Behind her, she heard one of the team members make a short sound. Something between skepticism and dismissal. The sound of a man who has already written his conclusion and is not interested in new information. Kreft said, "She is not qualified on that platform." Cray looked at him steadily. "I know." Blair walked to the back of the firing line. The M40A6 was there on a bipod range card clipped to the stock. She crouched in front of it without touching it and looked at the elevation knob. Her hand stopped moving. The crow's footmark was there. But it was not where it had been last night. The turret had moved. Precisely. Deliberately. Someone had recalibrated the scope within the last several hours. Someone who had checked the morning wind and measured the temperature and calculated the exact density altitude and made every correction necessary for a 600-meter shot in today's specific conditions. Someone who had been here before any of them arrived. Someone who knew which rifle she would be given. Blair looked at the adjusted knob for 2 seconds. Then she picked up the rifle. She settled into the prone position, the way people settle into things they have done 10,000 times, not performing it, occupying it, cheek-weld to the stock, eye aligned with the scope. The 600-meter target board materialized in the glass, small and precise, the wind pushing the range indicator in steady increments that told her everything she needed to know about what the air was doing between her position and the steel. She breathed once. Twice. On the exhale, she stopped breathing entirely. She fired. The round crossed 600 meters in less than a second and struck the center of the first target. She cycled the bolt. The empty case spun away into the dirt. She shifted to the second target. The wind had moved a quarter knot in the interval between shots. She adjusted without pausing. Fired. Center mass, second target. Third target, 612 meters. The crosswind had backed slightly in direction, a shift that most shooters would not register consciously. She registered it the way she registered everything in the field, completely, immediately. Fired. The range went quiet. Not the polite quiet of a passing performance. The other kind. The kind that descends when something occurs that makes the people present stop being certain they understand the situation they are inside. Kreft walked to the spotting scope and looked downrange for a long time, longer than the evaluation required. When he straightened up, his face was arranged carefully, but his eyes were doing something that careful faces cannot entirely contain. He said to Cray, "Who calibrated that scope?" Cray said, "The maintenance log shows no contact with that rifle in 6 months." Kreft looked at the log. He looked at the rifle. He looked at Blair, who had risen from the prone position and was standing with the weapon held correctly at her side, weight balanced, breathing even, looking at nothing in particular downrange. His face gave nothing away. She handed the rifle to the range officer and accepted the range card back for scoring documentation. She took a pen from the breast pocket of her utility blouse. She turned so that her back was to the firing line, facing the open ground behind the range, and she wrote something on the back of the card. She wrote for longer than a score notation requires. She folded the card once, put it in her breast pocket. Nobody saw what she had written. Kreft watched her do it. He said nothing. The team filed off the range in ones and twos. A few of them glanced at Blair with something different from what they had arrived with. Not respect, not yet. Something more preliminary than respect but more significant than its absence. The beginning of a recalculation that none of them would have admitted to out loud. Tate 4 was the last to leave. He passed Blair on the walkway and did not speak, but he held eye contact with her for a moment longer than the situation required. In that moment, something was acknowledged between them that would have been difficult to put into words, and neither of them tried. Blair walked back to her temporary quarters. She sat on the rack. She placed one hand flat on her knee and looked at it. The hand was steady. It was always steady, cold and precise and capable of the kind of work that most people prefer not to examine too closely. In the armory the previous evening she had seen a crow's footmark on the elevation knob of a rifle that should have had no marks on it at all. This morning the same mark, on the same rifle, at a different position, adjusted for today's wind. for this morning's temperature, for the exact conditions of the range she had just fired on. Someone had been in that armory last night after she left. Someone who understood what conditions would present themselves this morning. Someone who knew which rifle she would be assigned. Someone who knew the range card numbers before they were printed and had prepared for them the way a certain kind of person always prepares, which is ahead of time, without announcement in the dark, without leaving a signature that anyone would notice. Unless they already knew what signature to look for. The same someone who had written, in small angular handwriting, in the margin of a dead man's service record, 4 words. Request for eval, H.M. Mack. Blair sat on the rack and looked at her hand for a long time. She had not come to NSWC Coronado to prove herself to Nalin Kreft. She had not come to earn a score on a range card or a grade in a medical evaluation bay or any of the official designations that would appear in the program documentation. She had not come here for any of the reasons that appeared in the paperwork she had submitted 4 separate times. She was here because a man named Martinez had bled out in a country 10,000 miles away, while someone failed to authorize a helicopter. She was here because the handwriting in his file was not the handwriting of Home Cray. She was here because a crow's footmark scratched into the base of a turret adjustment is a very specific thing, the kind of thing only one person she had ever known would put on a rifle, put there as a signature or a marker or a signal, and she had recognized it in 3 seconds in the low light of the armory, because she had seen that mark on the first rifle she had ever learned to shoot. She was here because the man who made that mark had come here before her. She reached into her breast pocket. She unfolded the range card. She looked at what she had written on the back. A MAC address, a string of alphanumeric characters that would mean nothing to anyone who found the card by accident, everything to the right person. She folded it again, carefully, the same way it had been folded, and put it back. There were 60 hours left in the evaluation cycle. Whatever was going to happen in those 60 hours, Blair Mack had been prepared for it since 2 in the morning, working in the dark on a terminal that was not supposed to have her access level, finding what she had come to find, writing down what needed to be written down before anyone realized she had been looking. The question was not whether she was ready. The question was whether any of them were ready for what she already knew. Nalin Kreft did not sleep the night of the range test. He sat in his quarters at 11 in the evening with the lockbox open on the desk in front of him, and the single page inside it laid flat under the lamp. He had carried this page for 8 months. He had read it enough times that he could have recited it in the dark, in the field, under fire, without looking at it once. He had memorized it the way men memorize things that keep them from sleeping, not because they want to remember, because they cannot make themselves forget. It was a page from the after-action report on Operation Cedar Draw, Oman, 14 months prior. Most of the page was standard language, the kind of language that reduces what happens to men in the field into words that can be filed and archived and read by people who will never understand what the words actually mean. Contact time, grid coordinates, casualty count. But at the bottom of the page, in the section designated for medical support documentation, someone had typed a line that Kreft had thought about every day since he first read it. Kestrel 7 Delta, medevac requested 341, authorization confirmed 528. 107 minutes between the first request and the authorization to proceed. The official report said 47 minutes. Someone had altered the documentation somewhere between the incident log and the final filing. Kreft had the original. The original said 107. He had found it in Martinez's gear when it came back in a sealed bag from Oman. folded twice and tucked inside the field manual that nobody except Martinez had ever read, because Martinez was the kind of man who read field manuals. Kestrel 7 Delta was a contractor authorization code. Hargrove Meridian Group, Medical Logistics and Casualty Coordination Services, contracted to Naval Special Warfare Command 18 months before the incident. The contract had been renewed automatically 3 days after Martinez was buried. Kreft looked at the page for a long time. Then he looked at the M40A6 range card clipped to the corner of his desk. The scoring side faced up. He had taken it from the range officer's table after the evaluation ended that morning, before the officer had filed it, because he wanted to look at the back. The back had writing on it he could not entirely interpret, a string of characters that looked like a network address. Below it, a notation that meant something technical, something specific, something that Blair Mack had written down at exactly the moment he least expected her to be thinking about anything except the wind and the distance. He sat with both items in front of him and thought about what it meant that the corpsman and the contractor code and the handwriting in Martinez's file all pointed in the same direction at the same time. Outside, the Pacific moved in the dark. The base was quiet. He did not sleep. The second day of the evaluation began at Camp Pendleton, 40 miles north, at the Military Operations and Urban Terrain Facility. 200 acres of concrete and plywood and steel designed to replicate the kind of built environment where things go badly and decisions get made in the space between one heartbeat and the next. The integration exercise brief was delivered at 600 by the evaluation cadre. Simulated direct action scenario. 2 building objective. SEAL Team 7 as primary element. Blair Mack embedded as combat medic. Her task was to stay with the team, manage any simulated casualties, and reach the casualty collection point by the end of the scenario without compromising the team's movement. Simple on paper. Nothing in that facility was simple on the ground. The team moved in 2 elements. Blair was assigned to the trailing element under Tate 4's supervision. The assignment was deliberate. Trailing element in this configuration meant last to know, first to get left behind, carrying the heaviest equipment across the worst ground. She did not comment on the assignment. She checked her medical kit, verified her radio was on the correct frequency, and fell into position behind 4 as the team began to move. 40 minutes into the exercise, the radio on Blair's vest went silent. Not static, not interference, silence. Someone in the evaluation cadre had cut her frequency on purpose. It was a standard test, the kind run on every new team member at some point to see how they respond when the connection drops and the plan falls apart, and all they have left is what they know and what they can see with their own eyes. Most people panic, not visibly, internally. The panic manifests as over-movement, wrong decisions, the need to find another person and confirm they still exist, and the situation is still manageable. Blair stopped moving. For 30 seconds, she stood completely still in the shadow of a doorway and looked at the ground. The team had been moving northwest for 40 minutes. She tracked the pattern of boot impressions in the dry dirt of the facility floor. 5 distinct sole patterns from the lead element. She identified which impressions belonged to Kreft and which to the point man from the depth and weight distribution of each print. She tracked the direction of movement from the leading edge of the heel marks. She read the terrain they had moved through the way a person reads a sentence, left to right, finding meaning in the sequence. She identified 3 positions where the lead element could have stopped based on the cover available and the objective they had been briefed on. She moved to the nearest. Wrong. She found the signs of temporary position but no team. She moved to the second without hesitation. 4 minutes after her radio went silent, she arrived at the correct position, approached from the correct angle, gave the correct challenge phrase, and reported. She said, "2 OPFOR at Grid Hotel 7, northeast corner of the secondary building. They moved through 5 minutes ago heading south." Kreft looked at her. She said, "Boot impressions in the dust at the window. 2 different sole patterns, both moving under load. Direction of push indicated by the leading edge angle." He turned and looked toward Hotel 7 without speaking. He checked the radio log. Her transmission was accurate. The OPFOR element had been exactly where she said. He said nothing for the rest of the exercise. But he moved differently than he had moved the day before. Not closer to her, just differently, with a quality of awareness that had not been there when the day started. After the exercise, the team returned to the armory at Coronado for equipment check-in. Blair returned the M18 she had carried and signed the log. She was moving toward the door when something made her stop. The M40A6 was back in its rack at the rear of the armory. Rack card in place. Do not issue. She walked to it. The visitor log on the desk beside the rack had a new entry. Civilian consultant. Badge number C217. Time out 1047. Time in blank. The name field was left empty. Where a signature should have appeared, there was a single small mark. Not a signature, just a mark. She recognized the mark. She lifted the rifle from the rack and looked at it carefully. The elevation knob was back to its standard 0 position. Someone had reset it after the morning shoot. Below the turret, where the crow's foot had always been, was a small piece of folded paper tucked under the turret lip where it would not be visible unless you were looking for it. She unfolded it. It was a strip torn from the edge of a topographic range card, the kind used for long-distance wind calculations. 4 words and a letter, written in small angular handwriting she would have recognized anywhere. Wind shifted at 1100, adjusted. She stood in the armory and read it twice. The R. Not a full name, not a call sign, just the first letter, just enough. She refolded it and put it in the breast pocket of her utility blouse, next to the range card she had already been carrying. She walked back to the administrative complex. She did not look around her as she walked. She did not study the roof lines or the high ground around the base or the positions from which a man who had been trained to occupy elevated ground would choose to watch a facility he was responsible for protecting. She did not need to look. She already knew he was there. The question was not whether her father had come. The question was who had asked him to come, and when, and what it meant that he had arrived 3 days before she was scheduled to fire a rifle in a formal evaluation and found time to adjust the scope before she touched it. She thought about that question all the way back to the administrative complex. She was still thinking about it when she sat down at the evaluation support terminal and opened Martinez's personnel file for the 4th time that week. She had found the attachment on her second look at the file, 4.7 megabytes, locked behind an access tier that required authorization she did not have. She had noted it, noted the file size, and moved on the first time because pressing the locked file too early would have flagged her access. She waited until that afternoon to mention it to Tate 4. They were in the passageway outside the medical bay, the kind of conversation 2 people have when they are walking in the same direction, and talking the way people talk when they do not want to look like they are having a conversation. She told him what she had found. File size, access level, the date the attachment had been added to the record, which was 11 days after Martinez died. 4 walked in silence for a moment. Then he said, "I pulled that file 6 weeks ago." He said it the way people say things they have been sitting on for too long. I pulled it and I tried to access the attachment. Next afternoon, I got a call from JAG, Administrative Inquiry. They wanted to know why a SEAL Team 7 operator was accessing a deceased corpsman's personnel record without a declared case number. He paused. I told them I was looking for information about the transition of his equipment. They documented the inquiry and closed it. He paused again. I have not touched that file since. Blair said, who initiated the JAG inquiry? Four said, the inquiry form had a case initiation code I didn't recognize. I looked it up later. It was a contractor liaison code. He looked straight ahead. Hargrove Meridian Group. She said nothing. She walked back to the Master Chief's office and knocked once and entered when she heard him answer. Home Cray listened without interrupting while she laid out what she knew. The attachment, Four's inquiry, the contractor liaison code that had initiated the JAG contact. The timing of it, 11 days after Martinez died, the document added to the file before the after-action reporting process was complete. When she finished, Cray sat back in his chair and looked at the wall behind her for a long moment. Then he reached under his desk and took out a flat case and set it on the desk between them. He opened it and took out a hard drive and connected it to his terminal. He entered a code she could not see and navigated to a network folder that was not listed in the standard command directory. He opened the personnel file. He opened the attachment. The document loaded in fragments, decrypting as it processed. What appeared on the screen was not text. It was a network log, rows of packet routing data with timestamps and authorization codes and system identifiers. The kind of technical documentation that is meaningless without the context to interpret it. But Blair had the context. She had been building it since 2 in the morning 2 nights ago. She leaned forward and read the log from the beginning. 6 entries, 6 separate timestamp requests, all routed through the NSW Medical Coordination Network and all flagged for expedited processing under the Emergency Casualty Protocol. Each one acknowledged, each one held in a processing queue behind a single authorization gate. The authorization gate was code designated Kestrel 7 Delta. Kestrel 7 Delta was a medical logistics clearance node operated by Hargrove Meridian Group under their contracted Medical Coordination Services Agreement with Naval Special Warfare Command. The contract required Hargrove to maintain a staffed coordination line 24 hours a day for exactly this kind of request. The log showed the line had been routed to an automated response system at 3:12 on the night of the incident. The staffed line had gone to automation 3 hours before the first medevac request was submitted. 6 requests over 47 minutes, all acknowledged, all held, all waiting for a confirmation from a phone line that had no human being on the other end of it. The 7th entry in the log was a system timestamp. Authorization granted, 5:28. 1 minute after a duty officer at Naval Medical Center, San Diego had bypassed the contractor system entirely and issued a direct authorization. By 5:28, Martinez had been bleeding for 91 minutes. Cray said, he bled out waiting for a contractor to pick up the phone. The room was very quiet. Blair said nothing. She looked at the log and did not look away from it, the way you look at something you have been trying to see for a very long time and have finally been allowed to see completely. There was no satisfaction in it. There was only the weight of a thing confirmed, the kind of weight that does not get lighter because you now know the shape of it. After a moment she said, "Who signed the contract renewal?" Cray said, "The contract renewal was processed 3 days after the burial. Standard automatic renewal clause. No individual signature required. And before that, Cray looked at her for a moment. He said, "That is what we do not yet have." She stood up. She put both hands flat on the desk for a moment, not aggressively, just as a point of contact with something solid in the room. Then she said, "Thank you, Master Chief." She walked out. The vehicle was parked on the public access road that ran along the perimeter of the installation's eastern boundary. It had been parked there for 3 days, moving twice a day to different points along the same stretch of road in a pattern calculated to avoid looking like a pattern. Declan Pruce was 41 years old and had the kind of face that is easy to forget, which was something he had spent considerable effort developing over a career that required him to enter and leave situations without being remembered. He was dressed as a contractor technician because he was, in fact, a contractor technician, and the identification he carried was genuine, issued by a company with a legitimate contract to service the installation's telecommunications infrastructure. He had walked on base twice in 3 days, and nobody had looked at him twice. He had a laptop open on the passenger seat showing a security camera feed. The cameras he was accessing were not the base's official security system. They were 4 small wireless units he had installed during his second maintenance visit, positioned to cover the administrative complex and the armory entrance. He watched Blair Mack walk out of Cray's office and cross the administrative complex toward the temporary quarters. Then he watched the window of Cray's office, where the Master Chief was still seated at his terminal. His phone received a text message. He read it, typed a response, put the phone in his jacket pocket. He had been told the corpsman was asking questions about the file. He had been told she had been accessing networks she should not have been able to access. He had been told that if the Kestrel 7 Delta log was pulled by someone with the right technical knowledge and the right clearance, the authorization chain could be traced backward in a direction that certain people could not afford. He had been told to resolve the situation before it reached a point where resolution became complicated. He started the vehicle and drove to the contractor access entrance on the south side of the base. He had a maintenance appointment in the morning, Building 7, telecommunications inspection. He had been planning what happened after that appointment for 2 days. Building 7 was a 4-story administrative and training facility on the eastern edge of the NSWC Coronado complex. The ground floor contained briefing rooms and a medical support bay. The second and third floors were used for tactical integration exercises, fitted with movable partitions, and instrumented for scenario-based evaluation. The fourth floor was storage and equipment maintenance. The integration exercise for Day 2 of Blair's evaluation was scheduled in Building 7 at 900. She arrived early. The team was already staged in the ground floor briefing room. Kreft was at the front reviewing the scenario parameters on a wall display. Tate 4 was in the back running a comm check on his radio. The other team members were doing what soldiers do before exercises, which is check their gear and not talk about the thing they are all thinking about. The scenario was a simulated personnel recovery. 1 casualty on the 3rd floor. Team moves from entry point on the ground floor through the 2nd floor to reach the objective. Blair's role was to advance with the team, reach the simulated casualty, stabilize and prepare for extraction. Standard, controlled. Exactly the kind of exercise that had been run in this building hundreds of times. The scenario began at 9:07. The team cleared the ground floor in 4 minutes. Blair moved with them, not behind them, working the same angles, using the same cover, reading the building layout the way she had been reading environments since she was young enough to understand that understanding your environment is the first and most important step towards surviving it. They reached the second-floor stairwell at 9:13. At 9:14, the building's emergency notification system activated. Not the scenario simulation system, which was a separate network with its own speaker array. The actual emergency notification system, the one connected to the installation's security infrastructure, the one that could only be activated by a command-level authorization or a network-level override. The message that came through the speakers was 6 words. Live fire exercise status confirmed, Building 7. Blair stopped moving. Kraft held up a closed fist. The team froze. He looked at his radio. He keyed the channel to evaluation control and said, "Confirm live fire status for Building 7. The response from evaluation control came back in 4 seconds. Negative. We have no live fire authorization for Building 7. Confirm your status. Kraft said, "We are holding on the second-floor stairwell." Then the shot came. Not from a training weapon, not from the scenario simulation system. From the 3rd floor directly above them, the sound traveling through concrete and steel and into the bones of everyone in the stairwell in a way that training rounds do not travel. A single shot, sharp and definitive, the kind of sound that the body recognizes before the mind has processed it. Real. Then silence. Then a voice, not on any authorized radio frequency, not through the building system, but through the thin ceiling above them, and it was a voice in pain. Tate 4 looked at Kraft. Kraft said, "Move." They took the stairwell at speed. The second floor was clear. They pushed through the door to the 3rd-floor corridor, and what Blair saw in the first half-second was everything she needed to know about what had happened and what had to happen next. Tate 4 was 12 feet ahead of her. He went down. Not slowly, not with warning. He went down the way people go down when something has taken their left leg out from under them without asking permission. One moment standing, the next on the floor with his left thigh opened by a round that had come through the exterior window at the north end of the corridor, angled from a position outside the building, from somewhere in the maintenance access area that ran along the building's eastern face. One shot, one man down. Not random. Kraft called out positions. The team moved to cover on both sides of the corridor, 2 members to the north window, 2 to the stairwell door, 1 to the south end. Blair was already moving. She covered the 12 feet to 4 in the time it takes to take 3 steps quickly. She was on her knees beside him before the team had finished taking their positions, her kit open, her hands already at his thigh. The wound was a through-and-through penetration of the lateral quadriceps, missing the femoral artery by a margin that she assessed in 2 seconds as sufficient but not comfortable. The exit wound was larger than the entrance. He was bleeding fast and he was still conscious, and he was looking at her with the particular expression of a man who has been shot and is trying to decide whether or not to be afraid. She put her hands on both sides of the wound and applied direct pressure. She said, "Look at me." He looked at her. She said, "Through and through, missed the artery, you are going to be fine." He nodded once. She believed him, he believed her. She opened the tourniquet pouch with one hand while maintaining pressure with the other, applied it 4 inches above the wound, secured it, noted the time on her watch. 14 seconds from the moment he went down. She pulled a pressure dressing from the kit and applied it over both wound sites without releasing the tourniquet. Then she moved him. She got her arm under his and shifted his weight behind the structural column on her right side in a single controlled movement that used every pound of the strength she had been building since she was 17 years old, and a quiet man with a flat, dry voice had told her that her body was a tool, and tools required maintenance. She pressed Fours back against the column. She put one of his hands over the pressure dressing. She said, "Hold that." He held it. She turned toward the corridor, assessing angles, calculating fields of fire, looking for the position of whoever had taken the shot from the east side of the building. She had not heard a second round. One shot, one target, deliberate selection. Then the radio on Four's vest crackled. It was not on the team's frequency. It was on a channel she did not recognize, and it had been active for at least the last several minutes, receiving transmissions from somewhere outside the building, and whoever was on the other end did not know that Tate 4 was no longer in a position to respond. The voice was calm, professional, the voice of someone who had done this before in conditions that were controlled and planned and not improvised. The voice said, "She has the file, the Corpsman, Mack's daughter, 3rd floor, move to secondary and confirm." Blair's hands did not stop moving. But something happened in her in the half-second after she heard those words. Something cold and final settled into place, the way the last piece of a calculation settles into place when you have been working toward it for a long time, and the answer is not what you wanted, but it is what it is. They were not here for Kreft. They had never been here for Kreft. She pressed Four's hand harder against the pressure dressing. She keyed her own radio on the secure command channel and spoke in a voice low enough to carry only to the receiver. She said, "Master Chief, this is Mack. We have a shooter building 7, 3rd floor, 1 man down, stable. The shooter is not here for the team." She paused for 1 second. "He is here for me." Cray's response took 11 seconds. In those 11 seconds, Blair counted the exits on the 3rd floor from memory. She assessed the positions of 6 team members, mapped the likely approach angles from the exterior maintenance access area, and calculated the time it would take a single individual to move from the position where the shot had been fired to the closest building entry point. The answer was less time than she would have preferred. When Cray's voice came back on the channel, it was very quiet and very even, the voice of a man who had been waiting for a particular phone call for 2 days and had known it was going to come, but had still been hoping it would not. He said, "I know, Mac. I have known for 48 hours." A pause that carried the weight of something he had not enjoyed carrying. "The reason your father is on this installation is because I asked him to come 3 days ago." Blair said nothing. When the contractor surveillance inquiry flagged your file access, it also generated an alert that went to a monitoring system I have been watching. A monitoring system that has been watching Hargrove Meridian for 14 months. Another pause. "I did not tell you because I needed you to keep doing exactly what you were doing, and because I needed someone on the high ground before they decided to move." She processed this in the way she processed things that changed the shape of what she had believed to be true, which was rapidly and completely, and without the luxury of time to decide how she felt about it. Her father had not come because he had heard she was here. Her father had come because the Master Chief of NSWC Coronado had picked up a phone and explained to a retired Marine gunnery sergeant named Reeve Mack that his daughter had walked into a situation that was going to require someone watching from the outside. 3 days ago, before the evaluation even began. She looked at Tate 4. He was still conscious, still holding the pressure dressing, still looking at her with the expression of a man who trusts the person in front of him because the person in front of him has given him every reason to. She was still processing what Cray had told her when the stairwell door at the far end of the corridor opened. The man who stepped through it was not large. He was not carrying his weapon at the ready. He was moving carefully, the way a person moves when they have thought through what they are about to do and have decided that patience is the most efficient tool available. He saw Blair kneeling beside Four. He stopped. He looked at her without expression, the way you look at a situation you have accounted for in your planning and are now adjusting to in real time. He said, "Don't move, Mac." He said it the way people say things when they believe saying them will be sufficient. He said, "Where is the file?" It was not a question. Questions have uncertainty in them. This had none. Blair looked at him. Both her hands were still on Tate 4, steady, cold, exactly where they needed to be. She said, "Which one?" The man at the end of the corridor was waiting for an answer. Blair Mack gave him one. She said it again, quieter this time, the way you say something a second time, not for emphasis, but because you want the person hearing it to understand exactly what they are dealing with. "Which one?" Declan Pruce had worked in uncertain environments for the better part of 2 decades. He had been in rooms where the balance of a situation shifted in ways he had not anticipated, and he had learned to adjust. He was adjusting now. He could see it in his face, the small recalibration that happens when a man realizes the situation he is standing inside is not the situation he planned for. He said, "Don't play games with me." Blair said, "I'm not playing games." She reached into the medical bag with her right hand while her left hand stayed flat on Tate 4's pressure dressing. She did not rush the movement. She moved the way she moved under pressure, which was exactly the speed required and not 1 degree faster. She pulled out the range card she had been carrying since the morning of the first range evaluation. She held it up so Pruce could see it. The scoring side faced him. He could see the numbers. Distinguished Expert M18, 600-meter grouping M40A6, the standard data of a weapons qualification record. He looked at it. She flipped it over. On the back in her handwriting was a string of alphanumeric characters, a MAC address for a network node she had identified during 2 hours of unauthorized terminal access in the early morning hours of day 1. Below it, a cross-reference notation linking that node to the authorization log she had read in Cray's office. Below that, a timestamp and a file identifier she had pulled from the system before anyone knew she was in it. Pruce looked at the card for a long moment. He said, "How long have you had this?" Blair said, "Since 200. The corridor was very quiet. He said, "That's the night you arrived." "Yes." He looked at her with the expression of a man working through a problem he had believed was already solved, discovering that the solution was wrong, and trying to determine how far back the error went. She let him work through it. Then she said, "Martinez did not leave a journal. He left a network packet log, encrypted, attached to his personnel file with a file size large enough to flag as unusual but small enough to avoid automatic review. He did it 11 days before he died, when he understood what the authorization delay meant and who was responsible for it. He left it where someone would find it if they were willing to look past the conclusions and read the incident reports." She paused for 1 second. "I have been willing to look past the conclusions my entire career." Pruce moved. Not toward her, toward the range card. One fast step and a reach across the space between them, the kind of move that works when the person on the other end is not expecting it, when they are encumbered, when both their hands are occupied. He had misread her hands. Her left hand stayed exactly where it was, maintaining pressure on Four's wound, not because she could not move it, but because she chose not to. Her right hand came up from the bag and met his reaching arm at the wrist with a controlled outside block that used his forward momentum against him instead of trying to stop it. She rotated his wrist inward, locked the joint, and drove him sideways into the corridor wall with a single controlled movement that used her body weight in the way she had been taught to use it, efficiently and without waste, and with total disregard for the difference in size between the two people involved. His weapon arm was pinned against the wall. Her left hand had not moved. Four's eyes were on the ceiling. His hand was holding the pressure dressing exactly where she had placed it. Bruce was a trained operative, and he recovered fast. He wrenched his arm free and stepped back, and for 1 second the balance of the corridor was uncertain. Then the stairwell door at the south end opened. Kreft came through it. Bruce saw him. He did what trained operatives do when the arithmetic of a situation turns against them. He turned and ran for the north end window, the one that opened onto the exterior maintenance access ladder, the one that Declan Bruce had studied on the building schematic during his contractor inspection visits, and had identified as the fastest route to the exercise yard, and from there to the perimeter. He hit the window. He went out. Blair did not follow him to the window. She turned back to 4. She checked the tourniquet. She checked the pressure dressing. She looked at his face. She said, "Still here." He said, "Still here." She held his eyes for 2 seconds. Then she stood up. The armory bag that Cray had placed in Building 7 before the exercise was standard evaluation support equipment. It sat in the supply alcove off the main corridor, sealed and signed, part of the logistics chain that Cray had been quietly assembling for 3 days while watching a situation develop that he could not prevent and could only position around. Inside it was a suppressed M40A6 with a loaded 5-round magazine, and a range kit assembled for the exact conditions of the Building 7 exercise yard. 220 meters of open ground between the building's north face and the perimeter fence. The bag had been placed there before anyone arrived that morning. Blair unzipped it in the time it takes to unzip a bag. She lifted the rifle out. Kreft was beside her. He said nothing. He looked at the rifle in her hands, and then he looked at the window at the north end of the corridor, the one through which a man was currently moving across the exercise yard, toward a fence he was not going to reach without someone making a decision. They looked at each other. No words. There were none needed. Kreft had spent his career reading the faces of people under pressure and understanding what was in them. What he read in Blair Mack's face in that moment was not what he had expected to find there. It was not rage or satisfaction or the particular blankness that some people wear when they are about to do something they have been building toward for a long time. It was clarity. She moved to the window. The exercise yard below was flat and exposed, lit by October morning light that came in at a low angle from the east and gave the ground a quality of detail that worked in her favor. Bruce was crossing it at a controlled run, angled toward the northeast corner of the perimeter, where the maintenance access gate would give him a route to the contractor parking area. 210 meters, moving, open ground, morning wind from the southwest at between 8 and 10 knots, slightly backing. She settled the rifle on the window ledge. Through the scope she found him. She tracked the movement. She made the calculations. Then she looked past him. On the ridge that ran along the eastern boundary of the installation, elevated above the exercise yard by approximately 35 feet, there was a prone figure. The figure was motionless and had been motionless for some time, judging by the quality of stillness it had achieved. the kind of stillness that requires preparation and patience, and the specific discipline of a man who has spent decades learning that the most important thing a shooter can do is nothing, until the moment when nothing is no longer correct. The figure was behind a bolt-action precision rifle. The scope was aligned with the exercise yard. He had been in position for at least 30 minutes. He had a clean shot on Bruce, had maintained it through the building entry, through whatever had happened inside Building 7, through the man coming out the window and crossing the open ground. He had the shot, and he had held it, and he was still holding it. Blair looked at her father for 3 seconds. In those 3 seconds, she understood something that the whole evaluation, the whole year of investigation, the whole careful architecture of what Cray had been building, had been working toward. Reeve Mack was a retired gunnery sergeant of the United States Marine Corps. He was on this installation as a civilian contractor consultant under a guest badge that identified him as a technical advisor. He had no law enforcement authority. He had no legal standing to discharge a weapon against a person on military property regardless of what that person had done. If he fired, every piece of evidence she had spent a year assembling would be contaminated at the moment of discharge by the question of who had authorized a civilian to shoot and why, and under what circumstances. The JAG case against Hargrove Meridian Group would survive a contractor operative being apprehended by a Navy Corpsman. It would not survive the same operative being shot by an unauthorized civilian shooter, in a fact pattern that would take 2 years to sort out in military court, and give Hargrove Meridian's legal team everything they needed to cloud the authorization log, discredit the packet data, and bury Martinez's death under procedural complexity, until nobody could remember which direction the truth had been pointing. He knew this. He had positioned himself not to take the shot. He had positioned himself to make certain that nobody else needed to take it before she arrived at the window. He had been waiting for his daughter. Not to save her, because she did not need saving, because what she needed was 30 seconds of open ground and a clear angle and the legal authority that came with the uniform she was wearing and the commission she carried, and the 8 months of preparation that had brought her to this exact window at this exact moment. He had given her that. He had given her nothing else. Blair breathed out. She stopped breathing. She fired. The round covered 212 meters in just over a quarter second and struck Declan Bruce in the left knee at the lateral edge of the joint, shattering the fibular head and dropping him instantly onto the dirt of the exercise yard without killing him, without touching the popliteal artery, without doing anything except making it completely impossible for him to take another step in the direction of the perimeter fence. He went down hard. He did not get up. She kept the scope on him for 4 seconds. He was conscious. He was moving his upper body. He was looking back at the building with an expression that she could read even through a scope at 200 meters. It was the expression of a man who had underestimated something fundamentally and was now fully aware of the extent of his error. She lowered the rifle. Kreft was beside her. He had been watching through a spotting scope from the moment she fired. He did not say anything for a moment. He stood looking at the figure on the ground in the exercise yard, and then he looked at Blair, and his face had the quality of a man who is revising something important that he has believed for a long time. He said, "You had center of mass for 6 seconds." She said, "I know." He said, "Why didn't you take it?" She looked at him directly. She said, "Because we need him more alive than we needed Martinez to die." The silence that followed was a different kind of silence from all the silences that had come before it in the past 72 hours. Not hostile, not charged with the weight of things unsaid, just the silence of two people who have arrived at the same place from different directions and are standing in it together for the first time. Kreft reached into the chest pocket of his utility blouse. He brought out a watch, a Casio G-Shock with a worn rubber band and a crystal face scratched from years of wear in field conditions. It was the kind of watch that costs $35 and lasts a career if you take care of it. It was the kind of watch that men buy when they are young and do not replace because it still works, and because it has become part of the weight they carry every day. He set it on the window ledge between them. He did not say whose watch it was. He did not need to. Blair looked at it for a long moment. Then she looked out at the exercise yard, where Bruce was still on the ground, and at the ridge beyond the perimeter fence, which was empty now. The prone figure was gone. The position had been vacated with the speed and thoroughness of a man who had been trained to leave no evidence he had ever been there. She put one hand over the watch on the ledge. She left it there. The NCIS agents arrived at Building 7 40 minutes after the shot. They came in 2 vehicles and moved with the particular efficiency of people who had been briefed in transit and were clear on what they were looking for. Declan Bruce was transported under custody to the Naval Medical Center for treatment of a shattered left knee, and from there to a holding facility where the formal interview process began before he was out of the operating room. He did not invoke counsel immediately, which his counsel later described as the worst decision of his professional life. The information he provided in the first 6 hours was sufficient to open a formal DCIS inquiry into Hargrove Meridian Group's contracted medical coordination services across 4 naval special warfare commands. The authorization log Blair had pulled from the Martinez file was entered into evidence. The MAC address on the range card gave investigators a direct routing path to a network node that Hargrove Meridian's legal team would spend the next 14 months trying to explain. They were not successful. The deputy director of Naval Medical Logistics Command, who had signed the original contract and overseen the automatic renewal 3 days after Martinez's burial, resigned his commission before the formal inquiry concluded. 3 additional incidents of contractor-controlled medevac delay were identified in the first 30 days of the investigation. All of them had occurred within the window of the Hargrove Meridian contract. All of them had occurred under Kestrel 7 Delta. Tate 4 came out of surgery at 1400 that afternoon. He retained full use of his leg. The surgical team at Naval Medical Center Balboa described the tourniquet application as textbook. One of the surgeons, who had been operating in military trauma medicine for 22 years, noted in his post-operative report that the pre-hospital wound management had been among the most precise he had encountered. He did not know the person who had applied it had been managing a hostile operative with her other hand at the time. Blair sat in the corridor outside the recovery room at 1500 that afternoon and opened a small notebook she carried in the inside pocket of her kit bag. She had been carrying it for 8 months. Most of it was empty. She had been saving it for something, though she would not have been able to say exactly what until this moment. She wrote one line. She closed the notebook and put it back. She sat in the corridor for a while longer, listening to the sounds of the hospital, which were not so different from the sounds of any other place where people worked to keep other people alive. Reeve Mack came into the medical bay at the administrative complex at 1800 hours through the side entrance that opened onto the maintenance corridor. He was carrying his M40A6 case. He set it on the table without ceremony and without looking at Blair, who was sitting at the bench across the room cleaning her M18 with the same methodical precision she always brought to the task. He opened the case. He took out the rifle and laid it across the table and began disassembling it in the way he had always disassembled a rifle, which was from the chamber end forward, checking each component as he removed it, setting each piece in its exact position on the cleaning mat with the care of a man who believes that the things you maintain you in return. Blair watched him. She watched him for a long time without speaking, the way you watch someone you have watched for most of your life doing something they have always done, and you are seeing it differently than you have seen it before, not because it has changed, but because you have. Then she got up from the bench and walked to the table. She picked up the bolt assembly from the far end of the mat. She began working her half of the disassembly without being asked. Her hands found the components the way they always had, guided by the same deep memory that had found them on a rifle rack in a dim armory 2 nights ago, the same memory that had found them the first time, in a cold garage in a state far from here, when she was 11 years old, and a patient man had shown her that a rifle is not a weapon until you understand it as a tool. They worked in silence. 2 sets of cold hands, moving over cold metal in the quiet of a military facility at the end of a day that had started before most people in the building had been awake. The sound of components being cleaned and checked and laid back in sequence filled the room with the specific rhythm of the work, steady and unhurried, like something that had been interrupted a long time ago and was now being resumed. Reeve picked up the barrel assembly and inspected it, set it down. He said, "You aimed low." Blair ran the cleaning rod through the bore without pausing. "I aimed exactly right." He said nothing for a moment. Then he said, "Yes, you did." The work continued. When the rifle was clean and reassembled and lying in its case, Reeve closed the lid and stood up from the bench. He walked to the door of the medical bay and stopped with his hand on the frame. He did not turn around. He said, "There is a file on Cray's desk, Task Force Cobalt. The brief was approved 3 weeks ago. Syria. 2 physicians taken by a Hargrove Meridian Shell organization at a logistics compound 40 kilometers northwest of Deir ez-Zor. The window is 11 days from tomorrow." The room was very quiet. Blair said, "When did they decide on the corpsman?" He said, "When you submitted your CMRIC application." She looked at his back, at the set of his shoulders, at the particular way he stood, which was the way a man stands when he is holding something in place by not moving. She said, "You wrote H.M. Mack in his file." He did not answer immediately. Then he said, "Martinez called me 6 weeks before Oman. He had found something in the contractor logs. He needed someone who knew what to look for and was not inside the chain of command. He needed someone who owed him nothing and had nothing to lose." A pause. "I owed him the life of a young Marine in my charge, a man he carried out of Fallujah in 2005 when I could not reach him. I had more to lose than he knew." The corridor outside, the medical bay, was quiet. He said, "He asked me to send the best person I knew, someone who would not stop when it became inconvenient, someone who understood that the difference between a medic and a soldier is not skill, it is choice." He paused once more. "I sent him the only person I was certain would not stop." He walked out. The side door to the maintenance corridor opened and closed, and then the room was empty except for Blair, and the rifle case on the table, and the quiet of a base settling into its evening rhythms around her. Home Cray assembled the team in the main briefing room at 1900 hours. They came in the way they had come in on the first day, the same 8 men, the same folding chairs, the same particular quality of attention that trained people bring to rooms where things are decided. Tate 4 was absent. He was in recovery. He had sent word that he expected to be on the ground within the week, which everyone who knew him believed without question. Cray stood at the front of the room and did not use any documents. He said, "Hospitalman Second Class Blair Mack, United States Navy Fleet Marine Force Corpsman, is accepted to SEAL Team 7's medical specialist assignment, effective 0001 hours tomorrow morning." He said it the way official things are said, without decoration. The room was quiet for a moment. Nobody moved to applaud, and nobody was expected to. That was not the culture of this room or this team or any team like it. Acceptance in this environment is not celebrated with noise. It is acknowledged with the continuation of work. Blair was standing near the back wall. She had positioned herself there before anyone else arrived, not because she was uncertain of her place, but because standing near the back wall was where she had stood on the first day, and some things are worth closing properly. She looked at Nolan Kreft. He was in the back row with his arms at his sides and his face holding its professional expression. He looked back at her. For a moment nothing happened. Then he gave her one nod, a single, deliberate movement of the head, not large, not performed for anyone watching. The nod Martinez had used to give him in the years before Oman. The team noticed. Nobody said anything. Cray set a folder on the table in front of Blair. She opened it. Task Force Cobalt. Classification markings across the top. A brief of 2 pages describing an objective in northern Syria, a compound that had operated under the cover of a medical logistics depot until 9 days ago, when 2 physicians working for an international medical support organization had been taken inside it and had not come out. The compound belonged to a shell entity that investigators had traced back to Hargrove Meridian Group through 3 layers of subsidiary documentation. The window for viable extraction was 11 days. The task force required a combat medic capable of operating in a permissive through hostile environment spectrum. It required someone who could stabilize surgical casualties in austere conditions. It required someone who could operate independently when the situation required independence. Below the requirements in the final paragraph was a single line that told her everything she needed to know about how long this had been in motion and how far back the planning went. Medical specialist pre-selected pending CMRIC evaluation outcome. Contingency assignment active from application submission. 3 weeks before she set foot on this base. 3 weeks before the first range qualification. Before the TCCC lane. Before the crow's foot mark on the elevation knob. She had not been evaluated to see if she was ready for the team. She had been evaluated to see if the team was ready for her. She closed the folder. She reached into the pocket of her utility blouse and took out Martinez's watch. She held it for a moment. Then she fastened it to her left wrist over the sleeve and felt the worn rubber band settle against the pulse point for the first time. She looked at the folder in her hands. 11 days. 2 physicians in a compound 40 kilometers northwest of Deir ez-Zor. A window that was closing at the rate of 1 day per day, the way all windows close, indifferent to whether the people on the other side are ready or not. She was ready. The team filed out of the briefing room in 1s and 2s, back to quarters, back to gear, back to the work that never fully stops. Blair stayed behind while the room emptied and stood at the window that looked out over the exercise yard. The yard was empty now, lit by the base's perimeter lighting. The surface was marked in the places where the day had left its record on it, scuffed earth and tire tracks, and the small disturbances that activity leaves behind before things are cleaned up and prepared for the next thing. She could see the ridge on the eastern boundary from where she stood. Dark now. Quiet. The high ground where a man had lain with a rifle and a clear shot and chosen not to take it. Empty. She turned and picked up her kit bag from the floor. On the table behind her, alongside the M40A6 case that Reeve had left in the medical bay, and that had been moved here while she was in the briefing, there was something affixed to the case latch with a small strip of black tape. She had not noticed it when she walked in. She picked it up. A challenge coin, the kind carried by senior NCOs across decades of service, passed between men at the end of things that mattered. This one was silver worn to gray, the edges smooth from years in a pocket, the face showing the emblem of the 2nd Battalion, 1st Marine Scout Sniper Platoon, the unit designation Reeve Mack had belonged to during the years that had shaped everything else. On the face engraved in the metal, COLDSTRIKE. She turned it over. On the back, scratched in by hand, in the small angular script she had recognized in a personnel file, and on a strip of range card, and on the base of a rifle's elevation turret. Your hands, your call. 4 words. She stood in the empty briefing room with the coin in her palm and looked at it for a long time. Then she closed her hand around it. She felt the edges of the metal against her skin. The weight of it, not heavy, just present. The way certain things are present, the way the watch on her wrist was present, the way the notebook in her kit bag was present, carrying forward the weight of what had happened in a form small enough to carry and permanent enough to matter. She walked out. Behind her, the briefing room light clicked off automatically after she cleared the threshold. Outside, the California night was cold and clear, the Pacific moving in the dark below the ridge, the base lights holding the perimeter in their flat amber circle. She crossed the administrative complex toward the temporary quarters she had occupied for 72 hours and would vacate in the morning. Somewhere above the ridge the sky was full of stars that the base lights washed out, but they were there. They were always there. She looked at the ridge one more time. Just dry California dirt in the dark, and the faint impression of boot marks at the high point of the eastern boundary, the position where a man had knelt in the dirt and done the most important thing he had ever been asked to do. Which was nothing. Until she did not need him to do anything anymore. Then he had gone. She turned toward the lights of the base and walked into them, carrying what she had been carrying and what she had been given and what she had chosen. And the ridge behind her was empty and the stars above it were very far away, and the watch on her wrist kept time without asking anything of anyone.